On January 3, 1961, a physicist called Ed Valerio arrived at a covert nuclear test site in the Idaho desert late at night. Ed had been called in an emergency regarding an explosion at the SL-1 nuclear reactor. The three men who had been working that night had been unreachable. His companion was waiting for him in front of the reactor building, and Valerio waved at him for grabbing their gas masks. The two men hurried inside. They rushed up 3 flights of twisting stairs that went to the control room of the reactor, gazed past motors, condensers, and pipes to the small nerve center that managed the reactor. The only sound in the building was the frenetic chatter from their Geiger counters. Valerio noticed the needle indicating the highest radiation levels when he looked down. It was the highest levels he had ever seen. Valerio's heart skipped a beat as he opened the entrance to the control room. Inside, there was complete destruction. Pools of blood and water everywhere. Twisted metal all over the floor and clouds of steam rising over the broken control board. There were 2 mutilated remains on the floor, and it was impossible to identify who they were. But where was the third man, he wondered. Then he noticed something on the ceiling above him, something that would follow him around for the rest of his life. Guys, if you are new to Channel PLZ, support me and subscribe to the channel, okay? I make every video myself. It takes hours of hard work research to create a single video. It was the start of the atomic era, a period of nuclear power preoccupation in America. This could produce a limitless supply of energy that was essentially free. But it could also be used to produce weapons of mass destruction. Cities may be powered by this miraculous source, reducing reliance on imported oil, but simply, it had the potential to alter how the world was conducted. By the 1960s, nuclear power facilities were sprouting up across the nation, lighting millions of homes and creating thousands of jobs. However, the first nuclear accident on American soil occurred in 1961, and many seem to have forgotten about it in the hasty rush to the nuclear future. Why not SL-1? The majority of people are aware of the Chernobyl and Fukushima calamities, perhaps because the causes of the explosion are still shrouded in secrecy and false information. Was it carelessness, a fatal design error, or something more sinister, such as a murder-suicide or a crime of passion? How could things have turned out for everyone if the truth about the nuclear accident at Idaho Falls had actually been revealed? Idaho Falls was in late October 1959. 20-year-old American Jack Burns, an Army specialist, ran down the street and out his front door. Despite the Army's best efforts to ensure his punctuality, Jack continued to be late, and today was no exception. His first day operating a nuclear reactor at the U.S., he was on the verge of missing his bus to the Army's National Reactor Testing Station. The bus rolled to a stop as he arrived at the intersection. Jack jumped on board and tossed some cash into the till, and he noticed another traveler. He halted his progress toward the rear. He was familiar with him. They had completed the same nuclear training course in Virginia, and his name was Richard Legg. Jack sat in the seat across the aisle and inquired as to if this was Richard's first day. Even though he did not know him well, the United States established the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho Falls. 1949's Atomic Energy Commission, built in the desert, miles from any settlement. It was a top-secret location. Jack unpacked the lunch his wife, Arlene, had prepared, while he and Richard engaged in light chat. He enjoyed the way she chopped the crust off his sandwich. After only a few years of marriage, he liked it when Arlene did these kinds of newlywed things for him. Jack was an active man. He falsified his birth certificate and enlisted at the age of 17 because he did not want to wait until he was old enough to join the Army. This also applied to beginning a family. By the time he was 19, he had already married Arlene and had a son named Jackie. Jack believed that his employment at the testing station would eventually lead to a better, more lucrative position, a larger home, and a better life for his son and wife. Working with nuclear energy, however, was thrilling for reasons other than the money. He had the impression that he was a part of something greater than himself. The bus was now traveling through the arid Lost River Desert, which was made up of black lava beds, sagebrush, and burned ground. In the summer, it was boiling, and in the winter, it was freezing. After a while, the bus stopped. Richard and Jack disembarked and made their way to the chain-link fence enclosing the testing facility. A sense of disappointment washed over Jack. The two reactors around the main structure resembled grain silos, and the facility itself resembled an ancient barn. It looked like the scene of an old western, but he had anticipated the campus would seem modern, gleaming, and metal, like something from Flash Gordon. During his campus tour, Jack observed the reactor where he would be working. It was a 3-story, 39-foot wide metal silo known as SL-1, and it included a control room at the top of a meandering flight of stairs. Jack narrowed his eyes at the reactor. Although it was not particularly striking to look at, perhaps it would be more thrilling once he knew more about how it operated. He had to take advantage of the fact that he had already relocated his wife and child to the desert. In the weeks that followed, Jack made an effort to stay on top of his new work. Long shifts and late hours were necessary to keep an eye on the reactor, but being careless was not an option. He needed to remain vigilant. The tiniest mistake could spell the difference between death and life. Because of this, the work was both exciting and stressful. SL-1 functioned similarly to a gigantic tea kettle, since it was referred to as a boiling water plant. Boiling the water into steam, the steel reactor's radioactive uranium became extremely hot. After that, the steam propelled turbines, which generated energy. Jack's primary responsibility was to prevent the reactor from overheating, which may have catastrophic consequences. 100-pound control rods were used as part of the reactor's braking system to halt energy output and allow it to cool. These 100-pound control rods needed to be raised and lowered by Jack. It was somewhat like laboring on a building site. Jack encountered a significant issue during his first week. The control rods jammed halfway down when he and his crew were lowering them into the reactor to cool it down. Jack discovered they were caught when he attempted to turn the mechanism around to draw them out again. Jack felt irritated. He could almost taste the cold beer that was waiting for him at home just a few minutes before it was time to quit. However, he was aware that he needed to disclose this problem first. The issue was that Jack was unsure of whom to tell. In his brief tenure, he had observed that the Army preferred to identify low-cost workarounds rather than making the necessary repairs. Jack was therefore not shocked when he informed his supervisor about the sticking rods, and the man dismissed him. He seemed unconcerned, but he scribbled it down. He chose not to press the issue, because no one likes a noisy wheel. He wanted a promotion. However, a persistent voice in his mind kept asking, what if the rods continued to stick? What if they were unable to prevent the reactor from overheating one day? However, Jack was only a trainee, a newcomer paid to pull levers, and not a scientist or even an engineer. So he went home to that cool drink after leaving the campus. Arlene Burns, Jack Burns' wife, was having difficulty keeping up a few months later. In the winter of 1960, she was a young mother attempting to manage a newborn's insatiable demands. Little Jackie wanted to be held all day and woke her up 5 times a night. Arlene felt like she was drowning sometimes, but she loved her son. Moreover, she was lonely. She no longer saw her husband very much, though she hoped he was around more. She was proud of him. Rather, it was a never-ending pile of dishes, the clothes, the baby, and her. It was getting close to midnight. Arlene could not keep her eyes open for another minute, but she wanted to remain up for Jack. It was all right. They were able to catch up and spend the entire weekend together. However, Jack's side of the bed was still set up when Arlene awoke the following morning. Wondering if he had arrived late and taken to the couch to sleep, she slipped into the living room, but he was not there either. She heard a commotion coming from the driveway just as she was ready to phone the office. Rushing to the front window, she did so. Jack was fastening his skis on their car's roof. Arlene, still wearing her nightgown, ran out the front door. She questioned him about it. Jack waved his skis at him. In a flash, Arlene's concerns about her husband's disappearance were gone. Jack shook his head when she said that she needed a weekend on the slopes. She was mistaken. He was going skiing by himself. Arlene was momentarily immobile. She was stunned. She then found her voice and began to shout. How could he possibly consider on a solo trip? How about his son? How about her? Jack told her that he was dying at work. He had to break free and flee. But Arlene was much more irate as a result. She looked away from him rather than shouting. She did not want to agitate Jack, who had a temper, so she left him standing by the spring and stomped back to the house. Jack and Arlene's home life had gotten worse by the spring of 1960. Jack became increasingly distant. He was powerless to stop it. He was exhausted from work, and the last thing he wanted was to return home to a screaming infant and an irate wife. Jack headed to the White Elephant Supper Club on the evening of May 27th to attend a bachelor party for one of his SL-1 co-workers. He immediately made eye contact with Richard Legg, an old student he had sat next to on the bus on his first day at SL-1, as soon as he entered. "Come on over," Richard said, offering to buy him a drink. Jack's feelings toward Richard remained ambiguous. He was known for messing about and had a huge ego. Jack did not see the danger in a single drink, though. Richard proposed that they all go to a nearby strip club when the gathering began to disband at around 10 o'clock. 2 additional SL-1 sergeants chose to accompany Jack after he stated that he was game. Jack had consumed half of a bottle of tequila by 1 a.m. and was so inebriated that he was having trouble seeing clearly. A young blonde seated in a corner caught his foggy gaze as he looked around the pub. To his amazement, she squeezed into the booth next to him when he waved her over. Mitzi was her name, and she and Jack clicked immediately. Jack insisted that the night should go on even after the strip club was shut down. In order to host an after-party in his flat, he persuaded one of the sergeants. Mitzi was asked if she wanted to come, and he assured her that it would be worthwhile. The time was 3 a.m. Mitzi was left to the next man when Jack staggered out of the sergeant's bedroom. They haggled her down to just $2 per person, after she had first promised to sleep with them for $20 apiece. Jack stumbled onto the couch next to Richard after using the wall as a guide to get down the corridor. Richard was one of the few men who had refused to spend any time with Mitzi alone. Jack had planned to have a nightcap with Richard before going home, but the laid-back Richard of a few hours prior had vanished. He appeared irate and bitter. When he had a wife and a child at home, he began to make disparaging remarks about Jack having an affair with Mitzi. Shame flashed through Jack's mind. Who was he supposed to be? He drew his fist back and smacked Richard in the jaw before he realized what he was doing. Before he could retaliate, the 2 sergeants were tearing them apart and pushing them out onto the porch as Richard slumped backward. Richard was told to go home by one of the sergeants, who pushed him into his car. They vanished down the pitch-black desert road, leaving Jack standing there, gasping for air and gazing at the taillights. Tonight, he had gone out to ignore his problems. Rather, he had created an adversary. A few days later, Jack was sitting in a shabby office at the rear of a Texaco gas station, watching a man with a comb-over read his job application after he had left his shift at SL-1. After glancing at Jack, the Texaco manager inquired as to why he wanted the position. It was obvious money, Jack added. Why would anyone else want to pump gas, was signaled to follow him by the manager, who rolled his eyes. Jack was happy to work part-time, would give him another excuse to avoid the house, even more than the money. He was at his breaking point since he and Arlene had been fighting more than ever. He met some of the other employees who were taking a lunch break at the rear of the station after following the Texaco manager there. Jack quickly discovered that the Texaco boys were a tough group. They were fond of ladies and whiskey. They were, in other words, Jack's type. He worked as many shifts as his schedule would allow during that entire summer. He and his new pals continued to drink late into the night. Despite being in the center of the Mormon heartland, Idaho Falls had a sinister side for anyone who knew where to search. Jack hardly saw his bed between SL-1 and Texaco. Jack arrived late for his duty at the testing station one September morning. Despite being clean-shaven, he still had a strong alcohol odor. He collapsed at his desk and sprayed Listerine in his mouth. Jack was informed by a coworker that he had overlooked some important news. Richard Legg had received a promotion. He was now the shift supervisor and principal operator. Jack looked up at him, astonished. He had been hoping to get the job. Jack leaped from his desk and hurried to the office of his supervisor. He had a good chance of getting promoted if Richard did. However, Jack felt dejected and left the office 5 minutes later. Jack was informed by his boss that he was not prepared for a promotion. He claimed that Jack was inattentive and excessively socialized outside of work. Jack was taken aback. He believed he had taken care to hide his new way of life. He felt certain that Richard Legg was to blame for this, even if he was unsure how. Richard was the only one here who truly detested his guts. After all, a few months later, on January 3rd, 1961, Jack Burns nearly lost traction as he slammed his automobile into the gravel parking lot at SL-1. His clothing were rumpled on the rear seat. He had slept on a friend's couch for the majority of the holidays. Even though he had already had 2 beers by 4 p.m., it did not feel like enough. When he entered the SL-1 building, he was in a foul mood. Nothing appeared to be working well for him. He and Arlene's relationship was more rocky than before. After being rejected for a promotion, he was now forced to work a shift directly beneath Richard Legg, a man he detested. Only he, Richard, and a third man, McKinley, would be there. McKinley was new and would not be much use, and Jack had only met him once or twice. He also did not think Richard would do anything now that he was superior. That meant Jack would have to do all the work. After stumbling into the reactor room and punching his time card, Jack sat down at his desk and studied the day crew's to-do list. The most vexing chore of all caught his attention: reattaching the 100-pound control rods that had been lodged once more. This problem was still unresolved a year after Jack reported it. He was now beginning to feel guilty about the second drink he had consumed. He needed something substantial to drink. Arlene Burns was seated in front of the telephone a few hours later, at approximately 7 p.m., knowing that the call she was about to make would alter the course of her life. It made her anxious, but she was unable to put it off any longer. Jack was a deadbeat, a cheater, and an alcoholic. He and other women were the subject of rumors she had heard. It would be too soon if she never saw him again. She was offended by the tone of Jack's voice when he eventually picked up his work line after multiple rings. It lacked love and was contemptuous. Before realizing what she was saying, she began to outline all the issues with their marriage and then asked Jack for a divorce. Jack, however, stated that he was perfectly okay with that before she could retract it. They were done. He hung up after that. Arlene was taken aback. She was expecting a fight, an apology for the state of affairs, and a plea for him to return. However, he hung up on her as though they had not started a family. Arlene was at a loss for what to do. In an attempt to relax, she sat at the kitchen table. How long would it take her to pack up Jack's remaining belongings and place them in a box on the front stoop? She attempted to picture his reaction when he saw it. At that point, he would realize their marriage was permanently finished. Picking up the fragments is over. She burst into tears as soon as she imagined it. All of a sudden, it felt too cruel and final to be unable to think of Jack as her spouse. She recalled her wedding day when they were hopeful and in love. They could always find their way back, Arlene believed. Perhaps she had acted too hastily. Perhaps they would not have fought as much if she had been more encouraging and less worried about Jack's nighttime whereabouts. When no one answered, Arlene reached for the phone and dialed the plant. She began to pace the living room. It's called again at about 8 p.m., but no one picked up. Gave it another go at 9 o'clock. Nothing. She was terrified now. A group of firefighters traveled to the SL-1 reactor on the back of a vehicle during the bitterly cold January night. From the testing site, they were responding to a radiation alarm. That day, it was the third call. Firefighters had to react to all calls until the alarm system at SL-1 was rectified. Even though the first two had been false alarms due to a malfunction, the firefighters could hear the alarms going off as they arrived at SL-1. They hoped that after flagging down an on-duty soldier to make sure everything was all right, they could all return home. However, when they pulled up this time, nobody was there to welcome them. That was strange. The firefighters hurried into the building, housing the reactor. 3 mugs of coffee and a few partially consumed sandwiches were visible as they passed the break room. With the exception of the alarm, the station was dead silent when they called for the crew. The radiation detectors of the firefighters began to click as the men ascended the stairs to the control room on the 2nd floor. They did a double take as they peered down. In an hour, levels were pegging at 500 R. None of them had ever seen a higher level. The men exchanged glances. The question of what to do was answered. It was a death desire to be indoors with such harmful radiation. The backup had to be called. Ed Valerio drove as quickly as he could to the testing location. As he and a few other staff members hurried towards SL-1, a terrible sensation of panic swept over him. Valerio was in charge of the individuals who worked here as the chief physicist. He knew the 3 men on duty tonight. They were all in their 20s and relatively new to the position. After donning their gas masks, Valerio and his men hurried inside the structure. They paused outside and peered in through the glass of the control room. The interior was pitch black. Even the dull glow of the control panels was too dim for Valerio to see. He pointed a flashlight inside and cracked the door. Then he heard groaning and the repeated utterance of the same word, assistance. Following the sound, Valerio found 2 guys lying in a pool of blood on the floor. One of them whimpered and moved. His face was completely ripped off. His left arm was gone, leaving a bleeding stump, and his torso was twisted at an odd position. There was no movement from the second man. His face was still there, but his lifeless eyes were staring at him. However, Valerio was aware that the third man was on duty. Where had he gone? Perhaps he had managed to leave the room and sought assistance elsewhere. However, why had not the firefighters brought it up? He felt something drop against his shoulder out of nowhere. Valerio glanced up at the ceiling, and then he found the man who had gone missing. K-Person was impaled to the ceiling by a huge metal rod more than 9 feet above him. His chest had been struck squarely by one of the massive control rods of the reactor. The man was hardly human in what remained of his physique. He was a jumble of blood and flesh, ripped to pieces. Valerio let out a scream. He was powerless to stop it. It like something from a bad dream. A grotesque image of a gigantic bug affixed to a corkboard crossed his mind. He regained consciousness a moment later and began yelling commands. They had to take the man who was still moving to the hospital first. The injured man was loaded onto an ambulance that was waiting outside after Valerio and the other men hefted him onto a stretcher. The second man was then pulled from the wreckage, but it was much harder to extract the man on the ceiling. The rod was driven deep into the ceiling by an amazing explosive force, and the radiation levels were so high that no one could stay in the building for more than 60 seconds at a time. As a result, the rehabilitation process was both risky and drawn out. Ultimately, removing the third man from the ceiling took 6 days. Only after the autopsy were they able to identify the guys, since their bodies were so severely disfigured. The man who was taken to the hospital with the ripped face turned out to be Richard McKinley. Unfortunately, he passed away from his wounds while still in the ambulance. Richard Legg was the man impaled on the ceiling. and Jack Burns was the second man laying in the pool of blood. On the morning of January 4th, Arlene Burns heard someone knock on her door. Thinking it was Jack returning home to patch things up after their argument, she hurried to respond. However, she discovered 3 somber guests when she opened the door. And, judging by their expressions, she understood that a horrible incident had occurred. Soon after, McKinley and Legs Holmes saw similar awful events. The policemen kept the graphic facts from their wives. They would just state that their spouses had died in a horrible accident. The deaths of the 3 men could not be concealed from the people of Idaho Falls, even if the test site was secret. The news quickly featured blaring headlines about the blast. The first authentic mystery story of our nuclear age is in the record books now. Atomic scientists are probing the great Idaho whodunit, according to one article, which quickly transformed a harmless atom into a deadly Frankenstein. The 3 remains had to be buried in lead caskets because they were so radioactive. Now, test site officials were in a challenging position. 3 soldiers had been killed, and SL-1, which had been mostly regarded as safe, was now in pieces. What led to the explosion at SL-1 that evening was still a mystery. The Atomic Energy Commission staff soon identified the source of the reactor's overheating. The 3 guys had been torn to pieces by the explosion of the steel reactor vessel, which sprayed radioactive steam and pieces of metal everywhere. However, what was the reason for the overheating? The control rods were suspected by investigators right away. The control rods were never to be pulled out suddenly by the workers. Actually, their goal was to never raise them more than 4 inches at a time. They calculated that the rods would have to have been raised a full 20 inches in less than 1/10 of a second in order to trigger an explosion. In addition to being certain that none of the crew members would have been stupid enough to do it in less, of course, one of them had done it on purpose. Investigators were not even certain it was conceivable. Investigators quickly learned that Jack Burns and Richard Legg, 2 of the guys on duty, had a violent past and had been bitter enemies. Following the accident, Jack and Richard were the subject of a flurry of gossip in Idaho Falls. The possibility that Richard and Arlene were having an affair was the most sinister of all. The origin of this rumor was unknown, but it quickly spread like wildfire. Some believed it to be a murder-suicide. Jack's wife had just called to inform him that their marriage was finished. Perhaps he took 2 innocent guys with him when he blew up the facility because he believed that life was not worth living. The Atomic Energy Commission appeared to be eager to support the spectacular and obscene rumors. They released their final report to the public following weeks of interviews, role-playing, and going over the autopsies. In nuclear parlance, it blamed Jack and Richard for the catastrophe, or, as they phrased it, malperformance motivated by emotional stress or instability. One of the men had acted erratically because of something that had happened that night, and the explosion was triggered by that one erratic behavior. They claimed that a few bad apples, not the government, were to blame. The commission's decision was flawed simply because it was a traditional diversionary strategy. What was the most likely culprit, then? A poorly designed equipment coupled with a decaying facility that no one cared to repair. Those control rods came first. They were stuck 13% of the time in the 3 months prior to the explosion, which is 5 times more often than when the plant originally opened. Even though this should have been a concerning rise, absolutely nothing was done about it. Secondly, SL-1 had a bad design. In the first instance, why could the control rods have been raised to such a height as to trigger an explosion? Why were there no explicit safety rules in place? More cautions regarding the risks of raising the rods too high. Most likely because these reactors were designed to be operated by seasoned scientists rather than fresh out-training military men. No one of any rank stood up to defend them, and the media preferred to concentrate on the personal drama between Richard Legg and Jack Burns, in spite of all these glaring technical problems, design defects, and leadership failings. Why jeopardize their careers to protect 3 deceased men's reputations? The future lay with nuclear power, would grind to a stop as a result. Consequently, the Atomic Energy Commission remained silent and allowed the notion to circulate. Nuclear power stations were constructed across the nation in the ensuing years, but the sector remained vulnerable to a catastrophic disaster due to the SL-1 cover-up. That was followed by the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, in which radioactive gases were released into the atmosphere and the nuclear core nearly melted due to a blocked valve and careless plant personnel. Since then, scores of nuclear facilities have closed, and hardly none have opened in the U.S. What if the government had taken action to ensure that SL-1 did not occur again? Would some of the catastrophic incidents that have occurred here and around the world have been prevented by the nuclear industry? Perhaps hundreds of lives would have been saved if it were the case. However, Jack Burns, Richard McKinley, Kay, and Richard Legg all perished in vain since the administration decided not to take the lessons learned from SL-1